Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the last session in the Data Management webinar series. My name is Nancy Leonard, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. In case we haven't met, I work for Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission, where I lead the StreamNet program. PNAP, along with StreamNet, have co-led the planning of this webinar series, and I'd like to take a moment to thank the planning group, which included 13 people from a variety of organizations that all helped us pull together this series of presentations and webinars. We have a great data management talk lined up today. This is our third and last webinar. We'll be starting with Tami and then following up with Pat, and I'll go over the agenda briefly next. In the meantime, if you want to have additional information about other PNAP events that are always free and open to anyone that'd like to participate, you can join the monthly newsletter, and Amy will drop a link in the chat. And if you don't know where the chat is right now, we'll be covering that soon because I know not everyone uses Teams. So let's take a look at our agenda. We're going to conclude the welcome. We're not going to spend too much time during the welcome. Before we launch into the presentation, we're going to do a little icebreaker with live polling because we'll be using that feature within the presentation as well. And then we're going to launch right into Tami's presentation on best practices for data sharing and data use. We'll have a few minutes for questions at the end of Tami's presentation before we switch to Pat's presentation on ethics of data sharing in the environmental sciences. We'll end after Pat's presentation with a few minutes of question for Pat before we open it up to a broader Q&A. So if you don't have time to ask your questions right after the end of our presentation, you'll get a second chance at the end. So just to make sure we're all familiar with the Teams platform and the icon, so we're all successful in communicating, we're going to start off with a few tips. First off, we want to point out the mute button. Just for the quality of the recording and to make sure everyone can hear the presenters well, please make sure you mute yourself while you're listening to the presentation. If you phoned in and are not using your computer audio, you can use the *6 button on your phone to mute and unmute yourself. If you're having a problem with your audio and you can't hear me, you can go to the 3 elliptics right here, and I will pop open the drop-down button. In this case, it looks like it's opening upwards. You click on the device settings, and under device settings, you'll be able to adjust which microphone and headset that the Teams platform is connecting to. If you still can't fix your audio issue or have other challenges using Teams, you can drop a chat in the chat box. This is the chat icon for Teams. It looks like a comment box, and someone from the PNAP staff will help you out with your challenge that you're having. The other thing that we want to point out is as you're listening to the presentation or at the end of the presentation, when you have a question, you feel free to type it into the chat at any time. You don't have to wait till the end. You can drop it in here in the comment box, and when we get to the Q&A session, we'll go through the chat box and Greg will pick out the questions from the list of items that have appeared in the chat box. If you prefer to not type your question, but you prefer to talk directly with the presenter, you can raise your hand, and depending on which version of Teams you have, it could either be a simple hand button like this one, or you might be seeing a smiley face with a hand. And regardless of which option you have, you end up clicking on the hand icon, and that's going to indicate to us that you want to be unmuted so that you can ask your question directly. So now we're going to do a little bit of a practice run using the Mentimeter live polling that our presenters will be using. Amy's going to drop the link in the comment box, the chat box right there. So if you can take a few minutes, a few seconds, humor me, go find a chat box. We can make sure everyone knows what the chat box is. Click on the link and answer the question. And then I'll show you the results. Let's take a look. The results are coming in. The question is, how do you share your data? Are you using APIs or web services? Do you prefer the Dropbox? You use oversized email attachment, or are you still relying on the passenger pigeon? Looks like it's a tie between the Dropbox and a passenger pigeon. Oh, the Dropbox is gaining a little bit more. There's hope for us. And I'll give a few more seconds. I think the Dropbox must have it nailed. Hopefully over time with this webinar series, we'll be encouraging more of you to move into an easier world of API and web services to exchange your data as appropriate. Right, well, thank you for taking the time to play with us with this Mentimeter. At least now we know that most of you can find the chat box, which is important. And right now I am going to pass this over to Greg. Greg is one of our fellow planning group meetings, and he's also a colleague. Greg works for Pacific State Marine Fishery Commission, also with the StreamNet program, and he'll be taking over for us now, and he'll be introducing our speakers and handling the Q&A session. Greg?
Thanks, Nancy. And thanks everyone for joining us today. I think we've got two great data sharing presentations for you. First up, we have Tami Wilkerson. Tami is the librarian for the Columbia Basin Fish and Wildlife Library at the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. She has a BA in Environmental Studies from the University of Washington and a MLIS from Wayne State University. Tami has been with CRITFC since 2018 and is passionate about providing quality information services for Columbia River Basin fish and wildlife researchers. I personally have the pleasure of working with Tami on the data sharing planning group, and at StreamNet. StreamNet has a long history of collaboration with the library. So Tami, take it away.
I apologize. I just realized that I'm muted. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Greg, for the introduction. Let me get back to my first slide. Again, I apologize. Okay, let's start again. As Greg said, I'm Tami Wilkerson from the Columbia Basin Fish and Wildlife Library, which is a program of CRITFC. And thank you all so much for being here this afternoon. I thank you for taking the time to attend this presentation. And I really hope that you find it useful. So I am going to jump right in and start talking about data sharing and reuse. The first thing I want to address is how data sharing advances research. So why should we even be doing this in the first place? The obvious reason is because some journal publishers and funding agencies require you to share your data, but there are lots of other good reasons to make your data available for sharing. Complying with mandates is really only part of the picture. It allows others to understand and validate research conclusions, which strengthens research integrity. It allows for data aggregation, which in turn promotes knowledge synthesis and supports meta-analyses that critically evaluate and statistically combine results of comparable studies. Also, sharing data increases data circulation and use within the scientific community, which leads to wider dissemination of information and can also result in more informed decision-making. Data sharing encourages more connection and collaboration between researchers that can result in new partnerships and new findings. And on a more self-serving but still very important note, sharing your data can advance your career by raising your profile and increasing recognition of your work. Findable and citable data has value even if it is not associated with a formal publication. Plus, there is also ample evidence that studies that make their data available receive more citations than similar studies that do not. So the practices and tools I'm going to cover today all fall in line with the FAIR guiding principles for scientific data management and stewardship. These guidelines promote the findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reuse of digital assets, including data. And the big caveat is that this presentation really only scratches the surface of the guidelines. And I do encourage you all to go review the FAIR website for yourself for more information, because the guidelines provide an excellent foundation for success in data sharing and reuse. So before I dive into the nuts and bolts of sharing and reuse, I would like to ask a couple of questions to get an idea of what your experiences are with this. So my first question is, how comfortable are you sharing your metadata? I'm sorry, sharing your research data. And Amy is going to drop a link for this into the chat. Also, if for some reason that doesn't work, you can go straight to menti.com and use the code at the top of the screen. So we're getting moderately and quite a few varies. That's impressive. And yeah, in some institutions or agencies, you can't share the data. It's totally proprietary. Okay, well, that's good that we don't have anybody completely unfamiliar. That's a nice baseline to start with, and thank you so much. So my next question, if I can find it. Apologies, I seem to have lost my window. So my next question, here it is. How familiar are you with the FAIR principles? So very familiar, somewhat, you've heard of it, but you're not really familiar. Or maybe FAIR to you means elephant ears and amusement rides, which is perfectly fine. There is no shame in that. So most people have at least heard of it, which is good. Quite a few very familiar, so that's impressive. And a couple of, amusement ride goers, which is fine as well. Okay, great. Thank you all so much for participating and giving me an idea of your experiences and knowledge. Back to the presentation. Now I'm going to jump into the nuts and bolts of preparing your data for sharing with others. The main points I want to cover are the best file formats to use, file naming conventions, documentation that explains your data, and establishing parameters for the reuse of your data. An added bonus to all of these practices is that they will also help you to better manage and organize your own data, should you ever need to revisit or reuse it in the future. You won't have to frantically search through old files to try to recreate it. Having your data easily accessible is especially important too if your research is ever called into question. So starting with file formats that hold your data, it is very important to ensure that they will be accessible in the future, because if your data is not accessible or if it's incompatible with technology, it can't be used. And the best format options are non-proprietary and not tied to specific hardware or software. For example, you can use a CSV or TSV instead of Excel, or plain text instead of Word. The Library of Congress has recommended format standards for many resource types, including data, and this is a really good place to find suggestions of what formats to use. Additionally, your files should be unencrypted because encryption obviously impedes access. And if possible, your files should be uncompressed. Of course, when you're dealing with huge data sets, that's not always possible, but it's really the best way to go if you can. And you should also try to use formats that are commonly used by other researchers in your discipline, because it will be easier for them to understand and use the data if they're familiar with the file formats. So let's move on to file names. I like to call this the boring but important part because it really is critical. The best way to approach this is to create a consistent naming convention or schema from the very beginning. You want to be very prescriptive about this to minimize error, especially if multiple people are touching the data. You want to be descriptive enough so that others can understand what the file names mean, and having that consistent schema to begin with helps facilitate that. You also want to keep track of your versions. A lot of people do this manually by including a version control indicator at the end of the file name, such as V01, V02, V1.4, etc. The standard convention is to use whole numbers for major revisions and then decimals for more minor revisions. And to help with file naming tools, there are some resources. I really like this file naming best practices from Stanford University Library. It provides brief but concise explanations of how to structure file names, and also features a really interesting case study, including an aquatic research project that's dealing with large sets of image files. And of course, we are totally perfect and use the best file naming conventions right from the get-go, but just in case maybe you haven't, or you're dealing with files created by somebody else who didn't have a consistent schema, there is file renaming software available that can help you. The basic way that these work is that you enter your parameters and conditions for renaming, then upload your list of file names, and it applies the conditions to the names, and voila, they're all changed. It's kind of like a fancy find and replace for file names. So next up is data documentation. Data documentation will ensure that your data will be understood and interpreted by just about any user. It will explain how your data was created, the context for the data, and structure of the data and its contents. And by providing this context, it also, it also benefits you by ensuring that your data is not misinterpreted and subsequently misused. This documentation, it's usually in the form of a README file or some other similar kind of simple document that will go along with the data. So at a very bare minimum, these are the contents you want to include in your documentation: the dataset file, the contact information for the principal investigator or whoever else is responsible for collecting and stewarding the data, the date or dates of the data collection. It could be one single date or a range, the date you created the file, any licenses or restrictions you've placed on the file, and your preferred citation. So I put the citation in there mostly for you, for the person providing the data, because it's important. You need to get credit. You need to get proper attribution for your work. They're also really hard to create, so it makes it easier for the user if you provide a citation for them to use. And once again, this is the very bare minimum. If you do plan to share your data or data sets separately from a report or some other kind of publication, it's a good idea to add information for more context and to assure potential users that your methods are sound. And these can include your collection methodology, QA and QC processes, and any kind of manipulations that you made to the raw data. So to create your README file for your data documentation, there are some templates out there that can help you get started. This first one here from the Open Science Foundation is fairly basic, but adequate. But the second example from Cornell University is quite much more comprehensive, and I think it's worth it to add the extra information and the more comprehensive README, both for you and for the user, just to provide more context. But ultimately, the level of detail you need for README depends on the complexity of your data and how much context you need to provide with it. And I mentioned citations. So if you want to include a citation for your data set, but you're unsure of how to create one, because they can be tricky, CiteAds is a website that features a citation generator for many kinds of research products, including data and data sets. The one caveat is that your data needs to be in a URL format, so it needs to be either on a website or uploaded to the cloud. So managing reuse of your data. When it comes to managing how your shared data is used, it's best to make it as open as possible, but at the same time, it should be as closed as necessary to meet requirements. The parameters you need to put around how your data is used is first and foremost dictated by who funds your research, whether it be your employer or an outside entity. You will need to check with them first about what kind of restraint or protections your data needs when you share it. So first, let's cover licensing. Kind of a little known fact that in many jurisdictions, data has inherent intellectual property rights that prevent third parties from using, reusing, and redistributing the data without explicit permission. But by applying a license, you can give people permission to use your data. It is also important to apply a license to clarify how your data can be used and to ensure you get proper attribution. For some data, you'll need to go a step further and create a data sharing agreement. This most often applies to proprietary or confidential data being shared between 2 or more organizations. They generally include provisions concerning access and dissemination and are legally binding. Again, you should check with your funding agency to determine if this level of protection is necessary for your data. There are a lot of licensing options out there, but the most commonly used and the most commonly understood is Creative Commons. And they also have a really handy license chooser that guides you towards which license you should employ, depending on your needs. For data sharing agreements, if your funder or employer has one in place, that of course is the one that you should use, but if not, there are a couple of examples out there that can help you. The USGS has a fairly simple data use license agreement that is easy to edit and adapt for your needs and is really suitable for most situations. But if you have a more complex situation, the Federal Demonstration Partnership provides examples for many different circumstances, from one-way sharing of data between 2 entities to agreements between more than 2 entities. And very briefly, I wanted to touch on sharing of software and code, since they can often accompany your data. Generally speaking, the best practices are the same as for sharing data, like good naming conventions, documentation, and version control. If you want a deeper dive, I recommend the series of training modules from Johns Hopkins University libraries. It covers how to create understandable, reproducible, reusable, and citable software and scripts. It also addresses intellectual property considerations and ensuring long-term accessibility of your code. So now that we've covered how to prepare your data for sharing, let's discuss how to reuse data. So when people think of data reuse, they usually think of acquiring data from an outside source for you to use, but it can also include revisiting your own data for further analysis or to support related research questions. So the main benefits of reusing data is fairly obvious. It means you don't have to start from scratch in your research and avoids unnecessary duplication of effort. We all know how resource-intensive research is, so it's really important to maximize the value of the data that have already been collected by using it to extract new insights. It also helps to minimize stress on species that are frequently investigated as part of research projects. So when you're thinking of reusing data created by someone else, the first consideration is always, can it be used? And if yes, what are the restrictions in place? You may not be able to do whatever you want with it because of protection by intellectual property rights or confidentiality agreements. Ideally, the data creator has done all the steps I've already mentioned and provided documentation about this or has licensed their data. But if that's not the case, you'll need to get clarification from the author or barring that, whoever funded the research. Remember that it is important to ensure you have the proper permission to protect not only yourself, but also your employer. You also have to trust the integrity of the data. Be sure to check out the documentation for collection procedures, data processing procedures, and other technical information. If these are not available or if they're unclear, once again, you should contact the data creator directly to ensure that the methods they used are sound. And this one might sound obvious, but you do really need to make sure that you understand the data. Spend time getting to know and understand it to ensure that it is relevant for your research and applies to the questions you're asking. and also to determine any limitations it may have. And finally, is the good practice to assess if the data is in line with the FAIR principles. If it seems that the creator has followed these guidelines, it stands to reason that the data has a high degree of integrity. And of course, you have to give credit to the data creator. And not only is this ethical, but it also enables other researchers to reuse the data and ensures that your research is verifiable. So I previously mentioned CITES, which is handy for creating citations for data sets. If the data set you are using happens to have a DOI, you should check out the DOI citation formatter, which was created by a consortium of DOI registration agencies. This tool is very robust. You can choose from dozens of formatting styles and even styles for specific journals. So once again, I hope this was helpful. Thank you all for attending, and I hope it's given you some insight and tools into and tools to use for data sharing and reuse. If you have any questions about this, please feel free to contact me at any time. Thank you.
Thank you, Tami.
Mm-hmm.
It was a great presentation.
Thank you.
In fact, I wrote down a couple of questions along the way, which you then answered. So,
okay.
So fairly thorough, I think. We will open it up for questions for Tami. We've got a few minutes. Actually, we've got an extra few minutes.
Yes.
And if you'd like to type a question into the chat box or raise your hand, we could call on you and take questions for a few minutes. All right, we got a question. Any idea when the Go Fair initiative began? Just curious.
Oh, I'm not sure when it began, but I believe the actual principles were created around 2016. So it's been in the works for, at least 5 years.
Okay. And I did actually have an additional add-on question to something that I was thinking of. What a special case of recovering historical data and using that, maybe sparsely documented historical data and using that, is that a special case? And how is that handled?
Yeah, so in those kinds of cases, you more or less have to do the best you can. You still have to make sure that you have the right to use the data. If it's federally funded, you should be able to. But if it comes from any kind of a private organization or even a state fish and wildlife agency, you do need to check to make sure that you can reuse it. And just provide the context that this is the best data you have. And these are the limitations of the data because it is incomplete, and you're not trying to fill in the blanks or somehow figure out what was in there. It just be straightforward about the quality of it.
Okay. Thank you. We have one raised hand for a question. Dan Warren, could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hey, Tami. Yeah, thanks a lot. I work for Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife in Southwest Washington, and I really appreciated your talk. I'm kind of a mid-level data manager in our agency, and this whole concept of kind of data sharing and both the politics around it, the ethics around it, and the legality around it has always kind of both fascinated and kind of confused me. And I was wondering if you could speak just broadly, or maybe if you have some specific examples that are interesting, of just maybe specifically with fish data, because I think a lot of people in this audience work on in the salmon world, of just kind of how maybe different either state agencies or tribes are kind of sharing data or not sharing data, and if you just have any insight kind of specific to our work here, I'd be really interested in that, because I just get the general impression that even between other kind of public agencies, we're still kind of cagey with our information, and I don't really understand if that's for legal reasons or just historic political reasons or bureaucracy. So I'll be quiet there. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts kind of specific to that. Thanks so much.
Sure, great question. So from my limited perspective, it's really all three, you know, historical politics, maybe lack of technology as well, and just tending to be, if you don't, there's some, in some agencies, not all, there's the idea if you don't have to share it, then I'm just going to keep it to myself because it's important. It's my work, my research. I don't want to release it. I know specifically with tribes that harvest data is a very sensitive issue. There is concern. I won't necessarily speak from that for anybody, but I know that there is a level of concern that harvest data will be misused somehow and inflict on treaty fishing access rights. So that's definitely an issue as well. But I mean, and like I said earlier, I think a lot of it is lack of technology as well. And, you know, a lot of the state fish and wildlife systems are, this isn't a knock or anything, but maybe not the most technologically advanced as far as computing, because of lack of resources. So that's made it historically very challenging to share data. So people are more reluctant to do it because they see it as a burden rather than something that can, you know, facilitate the greater good. But actually, Pat is going to be talking about the ethics of data sharing as well. I think also in relation to tribal communities. So she might have more to say about that.
All right. Thank you, Tami. I think we probably have to move right along here. We pretty much used the time. We will have time at the end of the second presentation for questions for both Tami and the second presenter, Pat. So, all right. Dr. Patricia Soranno is an aquatic ecologist who conducts a wide range of interdisciplinary research in macroscale aquatic ecology, open science, and team science. She received her PhD from the University of Wisconsin, where she studied the controls of non-point source pollution in a well-studied lake in collaboration with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. She has been a faculty member at Michigan State University for the last 25 years and conducts both basic and applied research, including working with state and tribal agencies to set water quality standards in lakes. More recently, she has led large collaborative teams to compile and harmonize lake water quality data sets from a range of sources across the U.S. Dr. Soranno.
Thank you. I assume you can hear me. I
can.
Okay, thank you. So as Greg said, I started my career collaborating with natural resource agencies in Wisconsin to study one lake, Lake Mendota, that they had been studying for 20 years. And so it was an amazing resource. And I very much grew to value the benefit and the incredible resource that is in natural resource agencies and their data sets. And what I'd like to do today, I will be moving towards the ethics of data sharing, but I'd like to share with you how I got there to thinking about ethics. And I would like to thank Tami for a great introduction and overview of this topic. I can't imagine following a more perfect talk related to data sharing. So I began my faculty life at Michigan State University in 1996, coming off that PhD from studying one lake. But studying that one lake got me thinking, well, how does all of this knowledge for this one lake apply to all of the lakes in Wisconsin? And then when I moved to Michigan, there's over 11,000 lakes in Michigan. And how can the state agencies think about managing all of these lakes? And I was excited to move to Michigan because Michigan had these great land use gradients that you can see here, from agriculture and urban in the south to forest in the north. But Michigan also was a land very rich in aquatic resources, not just the Great Lakes, so you see all that blue. And in fact, I kind of ignore those because the inland waters of Michigan are amazing. There's over 11,000 lakes. There's millions of miles of streams and an abundance of wetlands as well. And so when I looked at these maps of Michigan as a young faculty member trying to figure out where my career was going next, I viewed it from the landscape perspective. And I viewed that, you know, we're used to thinking about landscapes as land, but there are also freshwater landscapes. And so I was really excited to start working with the natural resource agencies in Michigan and to try to better understand all of the lakes in Michigan, and in particular to start to leverage the emerging use of GIS. This was way back in the 90s when ArcGIS was actually still command line and quite challenging to use. Some of you, I realize, won't remember that. So I thought it was a really great opportunity, and I was excited to dive in. Also, based on my experience working in Wisconsin, I also knew that state, tribal, federal agencies, and a wide range of different sources of really high quality data, and I knew these existed in Michigan as well. So the idea was to couple the emerging GIS data sets with these smaller data sets and try to work with them together in the context of better managing with Michigan lakes. However, I came across an unexpected challenge, and one was data sharing by some of the natural resource agency professionals, but also some university faculty in Michigan. And to be honest, I tried to work my way into the agencies throughout Michigan, and I got to a point where I just got tired of trying, and to be honest, I failed, and I take some responsibility for that. But some of this was around the area of data sharing, and I don't want this to be blaming anyone. And again, this is not just the agency professionals. It was just challenging to sort of break into a new state system. So what I decided to do is say, well, maybe I'm going to expand my scope, and I'm going to try to work on all of the different research questions that there were at the time and still are to study freshwaters at these broader regional scales. And so I decided to pivot my career to NSF. And it took several years for us to successfully pivot, but we eventually did, and to ask basic questions about water quality at these broad scales. So our idea that we pitched to NSF was, well, let's build a database of all the needed information to better understand water quality in all lakes in this very lake-rich part of the United States. The problem, as I know you all are aware, and as Tami alluded to, is that each state has their own databases and their own database systems. Although they weren't all in paper files, they were in their own very unique and very special digital files. So we found 100 different sources of federal, tribal, state, university, and community data, but each was formatted differently using different standards. But ultimately, 6 years later, we were able to harmonize all these data sets, and that's we created Lagos Northeast, which has information on all 51,000 lakes in this region, and it has water quality data from about 11 to 12,000 of those, so where somebody went out and sampled. And one of the products that I'm most proud of, and again, Tami explained how you go about citing data. Well, this is one way we've done it, is by writing a data paper. And this is the data paper from this effort where we included authors, people who sampled the data, collected it, and shared it with us as a co-author. This included 79 co-authors. And what this serves to do, well, first, what did this take? It took $2.2 million, 6 years, 15 people, and many, many more from all of these programs to sample. But the outcomes we got were pretty positive. We, of course, made all of this publicly available. So we created an open access research-ready platform to conduct this geospatial temporal freshwater research. It also was a way to archive data sets that were not publicly available otherwise. So many individuals did share their data with us, and they were not available online. So this was a way to archive those data. And also through this data publication option, it means every time this paper is cited, these folks are getting credit for sharing the data, at least through citation. Now, when I say we, again, it took well over 15 people, but I also would like to acknowledge my co-lead in all of this, Kendra Charavello. We co-lead our data intensive lab, and we also co-led this Lagos effort. And we've had 2 teams working on this project. The Lagos Northeast team that lasted about 5 years, 15 people, 3 institutions, 4 disciplines. And then more recently, the Lagos US team, where we are expanding our footprint to the whole US. And so what I want to do now, that's just how I got into this. But I would like to go back to that unexpected challenge, because even after my initial challenges when I first moved to Michigan and tried to break in to the natural resource agencies and the other researchers, during our Lagos program, we also ran into some data sharing issues. And what this got, okay, so now I'd like to go to the first poll. And if you go to your chat window, Amy will drop that in. And I will get us there. Okay, so in your opinion, what is the biggest barrier to data sharing for natural resource or environmental organizations or agencies? I assume everyone has access to this. It's a word cloud, so enter free form. You can use a couple word phrase. Maybe don't use too many words. I'm not seeing the results yet. Oh, there we go. Now, I did this question open-ended for a reason, because I'm really interested in where you're coming from. And what's interesting is there's a lot of different answers here, and maybe not too much consistency, but a lot of the ones you've already, that Tami shared, technology, issues with ownership, lack of standards, resources, ego and trust, ownership. So one thing that that I do think, and is the reason why we wanted to go down this route, is because we feel like the issues surrounding ethics aren't always discussed. So what I'd like to do, go to the next question. Oh yeah, sorry. Okay, and if Amy can go to the next question. In your opinion, what is the most compelling reason to share data from your organization or agency? So just, whether your agency shares it or not, what sort of motivates you personally to share your data? the data of your agency or organization. All right, again, here we're seeing some really great answers and unique ones, but certainly some themes are emerging, things like preservation, benefit, obviously collaboration and reuse, but also things like greater good, self-actualization, public funding. And what I'd like to do for the rest of the talk, the second half here, is talk more about sort of the positive aspects of why we might think about sharing our data. I don't know why it went back there. One moment. All right. If folks are seeing my next slide. Okay. So I'd like to go back to this issue of the unexpected challenge that we found of people not sharing their data, particularly folks either at agencies where we thought that was part of the mission of the agencies, and as well as university researchers who are studying the environment. And so what we got thinking about is, well, are there any ethical obligations for natural resource agency or researchers to share their data? And when Kendra and I first posed this question, we realized we did not have the training to answer it. But fortunately, colleagues at our university did. So Kevin Elliott is a philosopher of science who works in the area of ethics. Georgina Montgomery is a historian of science. And we thought that their perspective could really help us answer this question. And what I was surprised to see at the time is that there's really not much written about the ethics of data sharing. And I think particularly around the environment or natural resources, it seemed to us that there were some ethical issues that maybe should be discussed. So here I'd like to give a highlight of some of the directions that both Kevin and Georgina pointed us in. So one is the issue that the public has rights to natural resource data because of public funding of data collection. This really came to the forefront in the OSTP memo that came out in 2013. I don't know how many of you remember this, but this created quite a stir for those of us thinking about open science at the time. And the title was Increasing Access to the Results of Federally Funded Research. And all major federal agencies were required to come up with procedures to make their funded research articles freely available, no later than 1 year post-publication, along with the supporting raw data. And how this ended up being implemented, I felt like it was much more focused on the publication rather than the data. But this is an example of making the arguments that if it's publicly funded, should the public have access to the data? The second argument, and you can quibble whether this is actually an ethical argument, but is that public funds should be used efficiently. So I'm going to give you an example from our Lagos Northeast study, where we collected about 500,000 observations. So these are where people went out to the boat, sampled the data, and then put it in the database. So we had about 500,000 of them. There have been some estimates that those samples cost from $1,000 to $4,000 to sample. And so the total cost to sample the data that's in Lagos Northeast is somewhere in the $500 million to $2 billion. These are wide estimates. This is just sort of back of the envelope. Now, the total cost to compile and harmonize all these data costs $2.4 million. So it only costs 0.5 to 1% of the sample cost to compile and harmonize and make a permanent archive of all of these data. And it's these kind of estimates that I think are arguments you can use to seek funds to support data managers, curators, and harmonizers. And a lot of times it is hard to find funding for data management. And to me, it is such an important part of everything that natural resource agencies do. And I think we need more of these arguments to argue that we need more of it. It's very cost effective. So another ethical argument, very different from the previous one, is arguments about environmental justice. And so environmental justice movements often call for increased open and participatory data collection in order to document environmental racism and inequality. And this is how the environmental justice movement, really began. But there's growing recognition of the intersection of data justice and environmental justice, and that this data creates a really important part, and that justice and equity should be at the center of environmental, climate, and data governance. And if you're interested in this topic, this Environmental Data and Governance Initiative looks to be a really interesting consortium of individuals who are starting to think about these issues. So the fourth reason is, as you pointed out in your answer to my second question, is environmental quality as a public good. And so if good water quality, biodiversity, clean air, stable climate are all public goods, then therefore the data collected for them are also public goods. Okay, and then finally, open data promotes public trust in evidence-based natural resource decision-making. And I would argue probably all of you who are at a natural resource agency have decisions are probably being made in many of them, or policies need to be made at the government level. And in looking at the literature, we found that really historically, and probably up until 10 or 20 years ago, the deficit linear model is how decisions were made. Scientists collected the data, they turned that into knowledge, they made recommendations to policymakers who made decisions that were then handed out over to the stakeholders and the public. But we now know today that I'm sure all of you participate in something called the roundtable model or co-management. There's a lot of different names for it, where scientists, stakeholders, the public, and policymakers sit at the same table and share data, knowledge, and co-develop decisions. And the studies have shown that when policies or rules or laws are made using the roundtable model, they're more likely to be accepted by the public. So another important argument. So to summarize the ethics surrounding data sharing, are these really are value statements that the public has rights to natural resource data because of public funding, public funds should be used efficiently, environmental justice requires equal access to data, and the important outcome of these value statements are that natural resource data are a public good and so should be publicly accessible, and that open data promotes public trust in evidence-based natural resource decision-making. And really these statements are, we articulated these for you to make the decision about ultimately what inspires or motivates you to put the work into sharing data. And we made this pretty strong statement, but what we tried to do is provide arguments that support this statement that natural resource professionals and organizations have an ethical obligation to share data to meet goals of evidence-based decision-making and environmental justice, and because natural resource data are a public good. So you may or may not agree with these arguments, but what we wanted to do with this paper and with this collaboration with Kevin and Georgina was to go through the arguments to see and to identify what kind of questions do we need to ask or talk about to decide what the ethics are. So there's a lot of remaining ethical considerations about data sharing, and I don't have time, and I'm not an expert in these, but I wanted to make sure to mention them. There's emerging work saying that community or volunteer science, this also is called citizen science, that there are some ethical issues about that and related to advocacy and what rights do the volunteers and the community members have to how the data are collected and then what's done with them. There also is some issues about ways to ensure that data are socially relevant and more transparent. So in other words, making the data available, like Tami was sharing earlier, we don't necessarily have to then explain what the data mean. But there are some calls that we need to do more than just put the data in a repository. We need to then help explain it to the public. There's also going to be special cases where we cannot, or maybe should not share data. And rare and endangered wildlife, particularly geolocated data, are a great example of that. And then, of course, there are unique and special circumstances about both rights and data access for tribal nations. Again, I'm not an expert in this area, but it is an area that really needs to be discussed from an ethical standpoint as well. And in addition, how we incorporate traditional knowledge into our data systems. We've talked a lot about data standards, and data standards are really important, but some forms of traditional knowledge will not fit within those standards. Okay, so what's the next step? So I would like to leave you thinking about what is your role, and it's really up to you to think about what your role is. And I see 6 potential roles for all of us. So first of all, some of us are data collectors and documenters, and my favorite data collector is Rachel Carson, because she not only collected the data, she documented it, she described it, and then she interpreted it. And she had huge impact from doing that. Each of these roles, in my opinion, is equally important for a different reason. Next, we also need data compiler and harmonizers. Now, you may not recognize the folks sitting around this table or even the name Lauren Gardner, but you probably have spent the last year looking at her research team's data. The Washington Post is my source of choice for where we're at with COVID numbers in my state, across the US, and globally. Well, these numbers are available because her research group figured out a way to compile these data and then make them available. So again, compilers and harmonizers are also really important. And data managers, well, data managers are the rock stars of the whole data ecosystem, because we would not be able to do anything without the great work, the creative work, and the careful work of data managers. A lot goes into data management. I've had the incredible honor of working with 3 fantastic data managers in the Lagos Northeast projects, and they made really important intellectual contributions to the creation of our data sets, and we could not have done it without them. Then, so these first 3 roles, you're probably used to thinking about, okay, I'm one of those things if I'm dealing with data. But I think we also need to be thinking about all of us in the data sharing space. Now, if you don't live with a teenager, you may not know what an influencer is, but I think we all might need to be data sharing influencers. An influencer is a person who has established credibility in a specific industry, has access to a huge or moderate audience, and can persuade others to act based on their recommendations. Now, as scientists, we probably are not going to have 26 million followers like James Charles does. But can we all think about ways that we can influence others towards data sharing in whatever spheres we have? And I also wanted to, mention an influencer, because I really think early career researchers are the influencers for data sharing. So a really interesting paper I came across that says results from 700 requests for data from publications from the past 20 years. And senior researchers gave a positive response saying, I will share my data 11% of the time. Early career researchers said 72% of the time. The numbers kind of speak for themselves. And really, since I started working on this, I've always looked towards early career researchers. They really are leading the way. And then finally, or number 5, are data sharing facilitators. And I would really like to thank Tami for her great presentation. I think that's a great example of someone helping to facilitate and sort of lead how we go about sharing data. I also did something a couple years ago. I was editor-in-chief for an open access journal, and I found myself giving the same recommendations to just about every author about how to share their data. And it was really quite simple, just 6 steps, those blue boxes. And so I published this kind of to make my life a little bit easier, but also to make it easier for anyone who wanted to share their data. And then finally, we need data sharing innovators. We need innovations in these ethical issues, in data standards, and in the culture of data sharing. And I don't know what the future looks like here, but I think anyone in those prior roles could be innovators. And that's what we need moving forward. So as we think about what role do you see yourself playing in this, we really are in a transition time of increasing data sharing, but we're definitely not there. And we're in a much better place than when I started out as a faculty member in 1996. But where do you see yourself? And you probably are used to seeing yourself in one of these first 3 roles, but I would encourage you to think about also seeing yourself in these other 3. And so what I'd like to do now is just do a final poll, and then I will wrap it up. And I would like you to select the 2 most common roles you have served in or would like to serve in your current position. So you can select 2 of these, and I may have missed one. So if you want to answer other, and then you can put in the chat window what you said. Now, Amy will go to the chat window for this while I move to it. Okay. All right, looks like just about everyone's answered. I am so excited to see the data sharing influencers, facilitators, innovators. That is really exciting. And I'm also thrilled to see data compilers and harmonizers. It's a role I've been playing for about 10 years, and I know how hard it is. And I also, of course, you know, the reality is we need those first 3, we should always have. We need people collecting the data, compiling it, and then also managing it or administrating it. So I'm really thrilled to see, and I would be interested in answering questions or hearing about your experiences being an influencer, a facilitator, or an innovator. And with that, I will end.
Great. Thanks, Patricia. We will open it up now for questions for Pat, and you can either raise your hand by clicking the icon at the top on the toolbar, the hand, or you can enter any questions you have in the chat box, and we will pass them along. By the way, fantastic presentation.
Thanks.
We have a couple minutes for Pat here, and then we will also open it up for a couple minutes to ask Pat or Tami follow-up questions.
Hey, Greg, are you seeing there is a question in the chat?
Ah, sorry, missed it. All right, so we do have a question. Are you seeing a change in how agencies are prioritizing data management and sharing in the Great Lakes region or elsewhere? Perhaps the change occurs with staff turnover?
Yeah, I mean, I don't, I don't have the pulse on, the agencies in the Great Lakes right now. Some of what I've observed is I do think there's an interest in better data management and recognition of the importance of that. So I've noticed that, but I do think it's going to take some staff turnover as well. Now, having said that, and I have said, I do think early career professionals are the ones who really get this, but I've also seen later career people also fully embrace this. So I think it's those that are later in their career and embrace this just need to have more of a voice. We need to allow them to have more of a voice. And I do think staff turnover will help because the folks that are in universities now, data sharing is just becoming a part of what they do, and they see it in publications now as well. So I think turnover will help, but frankly, we need to push it a little bit faster than that, and that's why I think we all, can play a role here.
Great. All right. Well, why don't we open it up to additional questions for either Tami or Pat. We do have another question for Pat. Do you think that more mandates will help push people toward data sharing?
I do. I think mandates are really important. And, that 2013 OSTP memo, I really saw that having an effect. And I also saw it having an effect, when I was working for a journal as well. So top-down mandates, I think, will really help. I think we also need sort of bottom-up, sort of grassroots. And then I think, we need leadership in agencies to really view this as an important part of their mandate and mission, frankly. And they need to really value the professionals that do this work and give them credit and pay them for what they're worth and view this also as a viable career option. So all of these things, I think, are part of the issues surrounding data sharing. So it's not just, are you willing to share? There's a lot of other issues around it too.
Okay, we have another question for Pat mainly, but Tami might have something to say. Who do you think should pay for data management and sharing? The funder, the collector, the public? Does it depend?
Maybe all of the above. And I would love to have Tami answer that too. I think it does depend. What I've tried to do, when I apply for funding, I always try to put sufficient resources in for data management and to make the data publicly available. It takes money, it takes time and resources, and it takes expertise. So I always try to work it into my budget. We need to make sure funding agencies are willing to pay for that, because I do think it's more efficient to curate your data when you collect it than to do it like we did, 20 to 30 years later. It's much harder. And Tami, yeah. I don't know what your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I alluded to it earlier. It's much easier to do things correctly on the front end than to try to go back and reclaim them or recreate them or kind of guess at what used to be done. And I've seen it more and more personally in the basin, as far as when people are applying for grants and things like that, they are specifically asking for funding to provide for data management and data sharing services. So that's an encouraging step, I think, in our part of the country.
Oh, that's great.
Great, excellent. All right, any further questions? We got a little time if somebody's got a question for either Tami or Pat. All right, well, I will hand it over to Nancy.
All right, thanks. And I want to thank everyone for attending our last data management webinar. And a big thank you to Tami and Pat for their great presentation. Amy is going to be dropping a link in the chat. It's a link to a survey so that we can get your input on how we can improve these webinar series, but we're also using the input you're providing in the survey to help inform an in-person conference we'll be holding in 2022. Just as a reminder, we did record today's webinar, so if you want to revisit it or share it with someone else, you can go to PNAP's YouTube channel and access the recording. It should be available in about a day or two. And you can also go to PNAP's ETIS landing page, the Emerging Technology Information Sharing page, to access that link. If you want to know more about future PNAP events, including data management topics that may be popping up, you can access information on those events through PNAP newsletters or even the PNAP website. And Amy's going to drop a link in the chat so you can choose to sign up for the newsletter if you're not already receiving it. And with that, the other thing we wanted to point out is that if you want to learn more about data visualization or other data management related topics, we do have another forum that PNAP collaborates with, the USGS CDI Data Viz group. And they have a webinar scheduled for March 18th, 11 a.m. Pacific time, which will be presented by Alvin Chang, a senior data reporter at The Guardian, on how data journalists think about data. And if you don't know Alvin, look up his website. That'll give you a really good idea what he's going to be talking about. And that concludes today's webinar. So thank you again for sticking around and have a great day.